Join me as we explore more of England's social history. This time we look at pubs and pub culture. Alright guys, welcome back to Social History Sunday. Now, the subject this week is one of those subjects where I could just rabbit on for ages. I'm going to try not to, because we're talking about the pub, the mainstay of English community. Now I won't say culture, but I will say community, because, and to give you an idea of why I mean the mainstay of British community, we'll do a quick comparison of a couple of other countries that have things that could be described as pubs. Now we're going to use the term pub. Well, basically, I'm using it to describe a standalone business whose primary custom is based on the selling of alcoholic drinks. So we're not looking at restaurants that sell alcohol. We're not looking at hotels which have a bar. So in America, now it's a little bit difficult to get exact figures because you have federal and state figures, but generally it seems to be that you have around about 50,000 pubs in America. Now that basically is one pub for every 7,000 people. So that's not a bad figure actually. However, Australia are winning on that point because they have 6,000 registered licensed pubs for a population of 25 million, which gives them one pub for every 4,000 people. So you're getting better. So I'm sorry America, but Australia beats you. However, you lose hands down when you compare your figures to ours. We have a population of, we're just talking England here, we're not talking about the UK, we're just talking England. We have a population of 56 million. And we have 48,000 pubs. That gives us one pub on average for every 1,100 or 1,100 people. So I'm sorry, but we win. I don't know whether that's something to be proud of or not, to be honest. But so, yeah, so for every 1,100 people, there is one pub in England. And everybody in England has their local pub that if they're going out for a quick drink, if they do such things, they will have a local pub. For instance, my local is one called the Horse and Jockey, which is literally 150 yards in that direction. But to give you an idea of, a little bit more of an idea of how many pubs we actually have, my local, the Horse and Jockey, is 150 yards in that direction. If I go 500 yards in that direction, there's a pub called the Sheraton. If I go, there's about 550, 600 yards, there's the Cross Keys. About 800 yards that way is the Mitre. Come back, there's another pub, can't remember the name of it. There's another local pub that's about 400, 500 yards away. There's actually a pub that's closed down, which is now a funeral director's, believe it or not, about 250 yards that way. So there you go, that gives you an idea, and that's fairly common for England, to be honest. It's not unknown for a village of 1,000 inhabitants, a population of 1,000, to have 2 pubs, 3 pubs. Thorpe Fuels has a population of 500, if that, and they've got 2 pubs. Carlton, so you get the idea. Now, why? Now we've got to ask ourselves why we have this pub culture. Now, to investigate that properly, we've actually got to go back to the Roman era. And the way they built their roads, they could build them up to about 20 miles a month. But for every 10 miles or so, they would build what they called a munition. I suppose we'd actually call it basically a maintenance depot, where the materials for the road would be kept and collated and sorted and organised and things like that. It would be serviced by a mason, a carpenter, a metal worker for repairing wagons, things like that. But it would also be serviced by food vendors or food preparation like businesses and alcoholic drink businesses. And at the end of the working day, the guys building the roads were encouraged by the Roman authorities to go back to the munition, back to the way station, and have a couple of drinks at the end of the day. It was seen as part of the team building, of creating a sense of camaraderie within the working men, who were essentially soldiers. So they'd go back to the way station and they'd have a drink. So at the end of the working day, this is where we see the start of the pub culture that we're going to talk about in a minute. Now, fast forward until the Romans have left, Christianity has come to England, along with the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes. And they are building their own communities, which are no longer based on the Roman road. They're based on topographical, like hills, things like that, and rivers and river crossings, that sort of thing. So they're no longer stuck in, but the way they're building their communities is around a central communal area, which we've come to know as the village green. In Europe, it tends to be the town square, the village square. In England, it's the village green. It's usually an open space where communities can come together for celebrations, and around the periphery of which businesses pop up, communal buildings pop up. So you have a church hall maybe, or like a communal hall. You'll have the blacksmith, the carpenter, that sort of thing will pop up around the periphery of the green. But you'll also see an alehouse as well. They're starting to, they're bringing the communal alehouse of the pre-Roman period, and they're bringing it up to date and putting it in a position where everybody has got access to it. Now, if you look at the way the Anglo-Saxons worked, they would go out in the fields or whatever, they'd do their day's work, and then they'd come in and because they're living around the village green, sometimes in the buildings they hold the businesses, sometimes just behind, they've all got ready access to the alehouse. So they'd go and they'd have a drink, and they would cement their friendships with somebody, like for instance, they might not have seen somebody all day. So they'll go, hi, how are you doing? Have a drink. And that becomes a centre of day-to-day life within the community. The green and the alehouses are cropping up, and the church. For instance, you would have an event in a church, like for instance, a wedding or a funeral, and it would come out, the congregation would spill out of the church and the churchyard, and one of the first things they'd do is go to the pub. We still do it in England today. Generally speaking, if there's a wedding, we end up in a pub. If there's a funeral, we end up in a pub. If there's a christening, we end up in the pub. After we've left the church or the crematorium or the graveyard or wherever, we end up in the pub. It's just the way it works. And this is a follow-on from the Anglo-Saxon, the way they did it. Now, if we fast forward a little bit more to the mid-Norman period, we're looking at the 1200s. The next thing that happens is we see the advent of compulsory archery practice in and around the village green. Sometimes just off to one side, but sometimes actually on the village green, where the target butts were built up. They'd come out of church service, and then they had to go to archery practice. Now, if it was raining, being typically English, what do? You go to the pub. And something happens now within the alehouses at this time in the mid-12th century, that we start to see the advent of pub games such as darts and things like that, which we'll do another video on later on. I've actually got something quite interesting planned for that. But we start to see the advent of pub games, which again is a way of building a sense of community, but at the same time competition within the community. So we have a situation where communities are coming together in and around the village green, celebrating events that have local significance, such as weddings, births, deaths, church events like Christmas and Easter and things like that. They're coming out, they're celebrating in and around the green, and they're using the pub. And this is one of the reasons why it's quite common in bigger communities where there'll be more than one alehouse. For instance, my little hometown of Billingham, which the village green is over 1,000 years old. The church is over 1,000 years old. Another video coming up on that soon. There's actually 3 pubs on the village green. Admittedly, one of them is quite a modern. It was actually built in the 1930s. But the other 2, the Blacksmith's Arms, was actually built on the south side of the green, and it's actually on the same. There's been a pub on that position for as long as anybody has got records, going back to about the 15th century. Behind the public house was actually a Blacksmith's Arms. On the other side of the village green, on the northern side, which is actually sort of like the northeastern side, on the northeast corner, there's a Smith's Arms. Again, there's a site there of a smith, not a blacksmith, but a smith. The difference is a smith was somebody who did any kind of metalwork. A blacksmith was somebody who worked in black metal. A smith might work in brass, white metal, polished metals, things like that. A blacksmith would work in the black using horseshoes, wrought iron, gate furniture, that sort of thing. But there was 2. And the third one, which was built between the wars, is just off to one side. So we've got 3 pubs within 150 yards of the church, all positioned on the church green. Now you go to virtually any village in the whole of England, and that's the setup you'll find. A village green with pubs around the periphery. For instance, as I've already mentioned, Carlton Village. You go down there, and the green area, population of the village is about 1,000, if that, and there's 3 pubs lined up around the village green. Thorpe Fuels, there's 2 pubs lined up around the village green. So that's just the way it goes. So we have a continuation of community. But it's this point as well, in the 12th, 13th century, that we start to see alehouses being given names as they become popular with particular groups of people within the community. For instance, you might have a pub that's called, for instance, the Cooper's Arms, because there might be a barrel making business just behind or to one side. So when they finish work at the end of the day, they come out of the cooperage, which is what you call somewhere when making barrels, and they'd go into the Cooper's Arms and they'd go to the pub. It didn't exclude everybody. It's just that that was the nearest pub to the workplace, so you'd come out and you'd go into it. The Blacksmith's Arms, in most cases you probably find there'll be a blacksmith's or a smithy or something like that, either part of the complex or just to one side, and when they'd finished work for the day, they'd come out of the smithy and they'd go into the Blacksmith's Arms. If you had something called, like for instance, I don't know, I'm trying to think off the top of my head now, the Cross Keys. It may be that the local business was making keys and locks and padlocks and things, and door furniture, that sort of thing, making doors. So there was a connection. You start to see that coming in. Specific pubs named after the industry of the area. And it continues, but again, it's all about community. People finishing work, like for instance, the ploughman coming out of the fields, finishing work for the day, going into the pub at the end of the day to have a couple of drinks and to reacquaint themselves with their friends and family over a drink. Nothing more civilised. So we'll fast forward a little bit more until the 1500s. Again, we've still got this community thing coming on, but now the government are getting involved. I mean, mid-12th, 13th century, we saw the regulation of how beer was made. When we get into the 1500s, we start to see taxes being charged by local and national government on the public houses and what they were selling. It's also when, as we discussed the other day, that's when we see things entering the colloquial, such as going on the piss or getting pissed, that sort of thing, from this time period, where pubs are becoming more and more involved in the local area and becoming more and more commonplace, and the government have recognised there's income here, so they start charging taxes, and it's taken out of the hands of ordinary people to the most part, and we see the advent of larger scale breweries building their own public houses as well. So now you have things like the Brewers Arms popping up. You also see now the advent of political history, social history being envisaged and evidenced by the names given to the what are now public houses. Since the invention of licensing, which the first one I think was in Leeds in 1515 or something like that, they are now called public houses, where anybody can go and drink, provided they've got the public house has a license. But you also see social history being shown in the names. For instance, even to this day, the most popular pub name is the Red Lion. Now that comes from the personal coat of arms of James I. Now James I was James I of England, the 6th of Scotland. His personal coat of arms was a red rampant lion on a barred field, that means bars going across, of blue and silver. And the Red Lion was chosen by a lot of pubs up and down the country. Now we don't know for definite if it was actually a royal edict, as in pubs must name themselves this or whatever, or whether it was just a show of loyalty and respect and acceptance of a Scottish king. Lots of pubs named themselves, renamed themselves the Red Lion, and it's still the most popular name to this day. I think a lot of people don't realise where the name comes from, but there we go. The second most popular name, now I think this is funny, there's a bit of an argument going on, depending on who's collated the figures, as to which is the second most popular name for a pub in England. It's either the Royal Oak or the King's Head, both of which date back to the English Civil War in the 1600s. Now the King's Head is supposed to be commemorative of the execution of Charles I, and a lot of pubs named themselves in support of the execution of Charles I. So you have a lot of pubs adopting that name. And then at the end of the Civil War, we have the Royal Oak starts to appear as a really popular name, and that commemorates Charles II evading parliamentary troops by hiding in an oak tree, which becomes known as the Royal Oak. And there's lots of things within English culture now which are called the Royal Oak, ranging from pubs all the way through to there's a brand of tinned ham that's called Royal Oak. And there's a brand of hot dogs called Royal Oak. So it's entered popular culture, and it still does to this day. For instance, one of the local pubs to me when I was living in Billingham was called the Telstar, which is based after the Telstar satellite that was put up into space in the 1960s, the first communication satellite. So you have, even to this day, you see pub names commemorating local events, especially if there's some kind of significance to the local community. And that's where we are today. It's all about community. As I said, there's one pub for every 1,100 people within the country. For instance, it's actually part of planning regulations that if you are a property developer and you are building a housing estate, a new housing estate, or a housing project, whatever you want to call it, of numerous houses, if there isn't a pub within 500 yards of the centre of that housing estate that you're building, you have to build a pub. So there's nowhere you can go in England where you will, if you can see houses, the chances are you'll find a pub. There's very few places where people live where there isn't a pub of some description. That's how commonplace pubs are. I mean, I've already mentioned Thorpefield's population of 500, they've got 2 pubs. And it's all about community. And it's still about community today. It's not about drinking. Drinking is secondary. It's about coming together. Now, the people who will go to the pub vary on the time of the day and the day of the week you go to see the pub. You go to the pub. For instance, almost every pub in the country, if you go on a Sunday afternoon, the pub will be filled with families out for a Sunday lunch. The parents will be having a drink. The kids might, if they're in a proper restaurant part of the pub or the beer garden, the kids might actually be having a drink as well. Because contrary to popular belief, the age restriction in this country to drink alcohol is not 18. The 18 restriction is to buy alcohol. You are legally entitled to drink alcohol if it's accompanied by a meal in a pub from the age of 12. As long as you're accompanied. But we've got a much more liberal attitude towards alcohol than a lot of other people have. That's why some people say we've got a drinking culture. We don't. We have a pub culture. It's not a drinking culture. It's a pub culture because the drinking part is secondary. So on a Saturday, most of the time, it will be the sports nuts. They'll be in there, especially these days, they'll be in there watching the local football match or some other sporting event, like a cricket match or rugby or something like that, while socialising with their friends and having a couple of drinks. I mean, if you, some of you guys who live in other countries, if you ever plan a trip to England, try and time it for an international football event, like the World Cup or the UEFA Cup or something like that, or even a national event like the FA Cup, and try and get yourself into a pub that's televising the match. You will find an electric atmosphere that's like nothing else. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic place to be. You will find yourself grinning like a lunatic at the antics and the fun and the cheering and the crying and the sobbing that goes on that's related to either winning or losing an international football match in a pub. It's fantastic. If you ever get the chance, take advantage of the pub when there's a match on. Most matches are televised these days, but you'll really, really have a good time. And you'll see the English at their best when they're enjoying themselves, having a couple of drinks and being social. If you go to the pub during the week, for instance, on an evening, most of the people in the pub will be young couples. People who are courting, they're on dates, they've gone to the pub to have a few drinks, just to chat and to get to know each other and have a good time. Or you'll find small groups of friends. Friday evenings you'll find bigger groups of friends who've gone to the pub in preparation to have a couple of drinks because they're then going to go on to a nightclub. You'll find stag parties and hen parties and things like that. That's like bachelor parties and bachelorette parties to you American guys and things like that. It's like a hen party, stag do. So they'll be having a few drinks and they'll go off onto a nightclub, or they'll go and do something else. During the day, during the weekday, if you go in like say a typical Wednesday afternoon or Friday as it is today, Friday afternoon, you'll probably find most of the people in there will be older, slightly older people. There'll nearly always be a little old couple in there having a quick drink. The old couple, they'll probably just maybe come back from visiting the grandkids in the pub, called it the pub, for a little bit of a socialise and to brag about how well their grandkids are doing with their friends. But there's something else you'll see in the pub as well. In almost every pub right across the land, you'll see the old boys sat in the corner. Maybe a lone old boy sat at the end of the bar talking to the bar staff day in, day out, or a couple of old guys, a couple of old boys who sit at the same corner table every day and they just chat and put the world to rights and they have a couple of pints. And they're there every day and have been since they retired from work. And that's their way of maintaining a connection within the community. Is they go to the pub, they have a couple of drinks, they talk to each other, talk to the bar staff. That's their community. And this is where this community feeling shines through in the pub. And people's lives have been saved because of this. There'll come a day when one of the old geezers doesn't turn up for his daily pint. And somebody within minutes of him not turning up at his fixed time, because they'll always turn up at roughly the same time each day, within minutes somebody is saying, where's old John today? What's happened to John? And I can guarantee within a fairly short period of time somebody will know what's wrong or what's up with old John, why he hasn't turned up at the pub. It could be completely harmless. His daughter's turned up with the grandkids that he hasn't seen for a couple of weeks. Great. It could be a little bit more serious. He's had a fall in the garden and he's laid unable to move, and he needs help. And within a fairly short order, somebody from the pub has gone round or sent somebody round to check on him. And honestly, lives have been saved because of that sense of responsibility. Because old John belongs to the pub and the pub belongs to him. And when he doesn't turn up, something's not right. something's wrong in the world, something's not right with the world, and people have a sense of responsibility and a sense of ownership and a sense of community. And that's what the pub is about. It's not about drinking, it's about belonging to a community. That's why we've got so many of them. Hope you found that interesting. Stay safe, keep slinging the sticks, and maybe we'll talk again soon over a pint in the pub. Cheers, guys.